There's a whole page in the Australian dedicated to the ecological habitats under threat in Australia. And Professor Hugh Possingham from the University of Queensland and Chief of the Biodiversity Council on the line. Hugh, you're one of the signatories to this. Tell us the issues here.
Hi, Matthew. Yeah, the document talks about meeting our international commitments. So Australia signed up to a whole series of commitments on saving biodiversity. And I think all of your listeners would know that biodiversity is in a bit of a mess in Australia, particularly in Australia. For example, we created something called the Threatened Species Index that shows that the populations of Australia's 2,000 threatened species are on average declining at 4% per year. So imagine if the GDP was going down at 4% per year. So that's the infrastructure that is essential to our prosperity, biodiversity. It's declining quickly. So we signed up, like almost every other nation in the world, to protect 30% of Australia's land and sea in protected areas. And to make that a representative 30%, not just the deserts and the faraway places, 30%, and also to manage that protected area system properly. And unfortunately, we're not really meeting those goals. We've got till 2030, so we're there trying to encourage all Australian governments to meet that commitment, that international commitment that we've made.
You know, Hugh, it's funny. We hear politicians of all colours, all stripes, talking about the importance of the environment and preserving bits and pieces. But your letter in the paper today talks about the government, the federal government, allocating just 0.1% of total spending on protecting Australia's unique and vulnerable nature.
That's right. And the people of Australia sort of get that now. We did a big independent survey of several thousand people, and we found that 95% of Australians actually want more spending on nature, and 0.1%, well, it's not a lot, is it? It might be one of the fins on one of the propellers of one of those submarines we're about to buy. It seems a tiny amount. It's well below the international OECD standards. And if we keep spending at that low level, we're never going to meet our commitments, and we're not going to stop the decline of biodiversity. Obviously, in many places in Australia, particularly also in South Australia, the philanthropy is stepping up a bit, the not-for-profit sector is stepping up, and some industries are stepping up to do protection, but we're still falling well short. So the private sector is starting to do a lot of the heavy lifting. We really just want government to match that. And there were big schemes in the past, in the early 2000s, where the federal government were investing hundreds of millions of dollars in combination with the states and also not-for-profits to increase the protected area system, but that money has all since fallen away.
Indeed. A lot depends on this. I mean, we talk about the environment and think it's somewhere out there, but I mean, at the end of the day, food production depends on a healthy environment and ecological system.
Oh, you're exactly right. I mean, the key one is pollination services. A lot of our crops, a lot of what we eat has to be pollinated by something. And these days, a lot of that happens with honeybees, but there are thousands of Australian native bees that also contribute. And many of your listeners will also know about the varroa mite and other diseases that we're getting in the honeybee industry. So there's quite a collapse going on in honeybees. The bee owners know this. It's harder to move them around. I don't know how far it's got into South Australia. I was born in South Australia, but I only go back 3 or 4 times a year. It's rife in New South Wales. So we really need that biodiversity. Soil productivity, of course, all our crops is driven by soil productivity, and that relies on a huge number of organisms. And then Australia's export tourism industry is almost entirely reliant on biodiversity. There was work done 10 years ago showing that just the koala, just that one species, is probably worth $2 billion a year to the Australian economy. $2 billion a year.
And that's in tourism, presumably.
That's right. Yeah. Most of that's because a huge number of people largely come to Australia. They don't come for the nightclubs, to be honest, and maybe a few come for the beaches. But what's Australia got that nobody else has got in the world? Just nature that nobody else can see anywhere else. Even a common kangaroo, which we would all take for granted, is amazing to overseas people. The fact you can walk around the streets of Adelaide and see half a dozen species of parrot, galahs, sulphur-crested cockatoos, fabulous things like that we again take for granted.
Yeah.
These blow people's minds. I mean, and they're very excited about that. And obviously, testing that ranges hugely from nature. So it's a gigantic industry.
Yeah, it is. And part of the answer there and the reason why we see all this, and you're right, we totally take it for granted, but it's a huge country and we haven't filled it. And so therefore what still survives is pretty special, even though we fail to recognise that sometimes.
Yeah, and also we are the most isolated continent in the world. I mean, we've been wandering north for 50 million years almost on our own. So nothing we have is like anywhere else in the world. And we know that about the marsupials. So, things like the platypus and the echidna, egg-laying mammals, right? What's a mammal doing laying an egg?
Yeah.
That's a bird. So these things just don't exist anywhere else on the planet. People probably don't even realise that a lot of common bush birds, like the willy wagtail that many people have in their back garden, that's not related to anything else in the rest of the planet. These are quite unusual and unique species. The birdwatching industry alone in the United States is worth $260 billion a year. I say B, not M.
Yeah.
Birdwatching is $260 billion a year. So all those people want to come to Australia at least once or twice in their life, and they want to see the flora, the fauna, the large landscapes, the deserts, the rainforests that we have to offer.
Indeed. One of the points in your letter talking about the highest species extinction rates in the world is what we're facing unless we get on top of this. And that's concerning. Kangaroos, you'd think, wouldn't be on that list. Koalas seem to be endangered on the East Coast, not so much here. They're here in abundant numbers in SA, as you'd be aware.
Yes, and they're doing reasonably well in South Australia and Victoria, and their numbers are growing. And, there are encouraging signs. I spent a lot of time down on the Limestone Coast, and I've seen increases in the abundance of things like wallabies, which were once shot routinely, in the early part of last century. If there was a mammal, you shot it. And the fact that we don't do those things is now enabled them to increase. Koalas are spreading, the common wombats are spreading. The trick is there's not a lot of habitat left. And although actually technically South Australia has quite a large protected area system, the southern agricultural regions are quite poorly protected. Places like the lower southeast, the mid-north, the York Peninsula area, the reserve systems there are only 5 or 6%. And this is where we need to do large-scale restoration and protect every single piece of habitat that's left, because there's so little. There's no real excuse for putting more houses and agriculture and mines on native vegetation when there's such a small amount left in the agricultural districts.
What do you make then of solar farms, wind farms taking over agricultural areas, farming land, particularly through New South Wales, which is copping it? Up in Queensland, wind farms being put in rainforests. So it makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I think there again this is all about planning. And I am on the Native Vegetation Council in South Australia, and I assist Queensland and New South Wales a lot with planning issues. You can have a win-win outcome. It's just if you don't have proper planning, we've repeatedly proposed there should be red zones. These are places, don't bother applying for a wind farm or a solar farm here because it's too important for nature. That might only be a few percent of the country. Then there would be possibly green zones. This is degraded agricultural land. It's not high-value agricultural land. It doesn't have much biodiversity. You're not going to have problems with soil erosion. These are the places we should be encouraging development and actually making development easier and faster, because environmental regulations often slow things down, and we need this energy transition to move really quickly ahead. And those maps are essential with the red and the green zones. And then there's going to be some mushy stuff in the middle where we're going to have to regulate and offset and do a whole bit of other things. But so you're exactly right. We've been promising these plans, state and federal government plans that everybody agrees to, including local council, where the developers, whether they're housing, wind farms, solar farms, mining, critical minerals, the rules are very clear and they're on a map. And then surely that would help progress from both an economic perspective and a biodiversity perspective.
Got a long way to go, but 30by30.org.au if people want to check it out, and that's protecting 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030. 30by30 at the numbers.org.au, and people can go there and have a look at some of the material we're presenting. Hugh, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matthew.
Professor Hugh Possingham from the University of Queensland, Chief of the Biodiversity Council as well. Big full-page ad in the Australian today on getting on with protecting nature. And the article also, or the ad, goes on to say since settlement in Australia, so we're talking 240-odd years, 40% of our forests have been destroyed since European settlement, and 19 Australian ecosystems showing signs of collapse, facing one of the highest species extinction rates in the world, with the overall state of our environment on a consistent downward trend, which is very pessimistic, you'd have to say, as to the future. But this campaign urging the federal government to spend more on conservation of important areas, and they are. You know, we can talk about climate change and everything else, but to lose any more of what we've lost in Australia in terms of native land would be a crying shame.